You made me sound kind of like an asshole. So, I'm glad I started with that. That's a good way to start. And I also like this microphone. It makes me feel funnier, like I'm going to tell you lots of jokes. I'm going to set a timer because I can talk probably for the next 5 hours if you wanted. But I'd rather hear from you in terms of these ideas. So the first thing I wanted to do is thank Brandon as well as Carmen and Chelsea because I think they put a bug in his ear in terms of this topic of childhood and recommended me to speak. I often give lectures in kind of academic circles and at the university, and so I'm really excited to share these ideas with a kind of broader range of people and get feedback as well. So we'll start with that. I have some notes. I'm going to try and go from there, but this is going to be pretty messy, I hope. That's a little bit my intent. So when Brandon and I started talking, I feel like I need a table or something. When Brandon and I started talking about the idea of childhood, there was lots of things that came to mind, and I think the reason why I was talking so much is because I thought of an idea and it led to another idea, and so yes, it went deep fast. But one of the things I thought about is this idea of play. That happens a lot, and a lot of people are talking about in terms of design circles, and I think there was actually a talk last year about it. And I think that's really great, but it also worries me sometimes. Because it seems that when we have a good idea about something, we label it, and then it becomes common sense. Like, of course designers play. That's great. And so when these words become common sense, play is maybe one of them, experimentation is maybe one of them. My favorite, the C word, creativity, is one of them. I think when they become common sense, it means we're less likely to actually think about them. Everyone knows what play means. Everyone knows what creativity is. So we don't actually have to talk about it or think about it. Maybe. And so this is really at the heart of my projects, my research projects, is how do these ways of thinking about concepts become solidified? And how might we start to unroot them or ask new questions in terms of what things mean? But not only what they mean, but what they do. So I was thinking childhood. Okay, there's that idea of play, experimentation. We could talk about that. But what if we start thinking about the way that we think about thought itself? And then I was like, what am I talking about? No one's going to be interested in that. But what does interest me about this idea of childhood is how it might act as a figure of thought. So that we can start looking at some of the common sense notions of the world that we've come to know as true or something that everybody knows, and take on the role of a child in some ways to start questioning those things. So I started with this quote here. I will say that my friends call me a Deleuzer, which I don't know if we have any Deleuze fans in the house. No. Great, that's why I'm a Deleuzer. Gilles Deleuze is a philosopher, kind of after 68, I won't go into too much. But he says, one of the things he said once in a conversation with Michel Foucault was, if the protests of children were heard in kindergarten, if their questions were attended to, it would be enough to explode the entire educational system. And for me, this is really interesting, not just in terms of childhood or education, but what happens if we start to ask questions and explode some of our own thinking about the world? What might happen? I don't know the answer, so that's what I'm hoping to explore with you today. Like I said, for me, this is kind of at the heart of my research, this big question of it, how is it that we have come to think the world, and what is it that thinking produces? What does it do? So in this talk, I should give a few caveats. I'm not interested in like good thinking and bad thinking, and everyone should think like this, because that's part of the problem, especially in terms of education. But I'm more interested in asking, what does our thinking do? How does it actually create a world? Because that, I think, is key. So in this talk, I'm going to poke and prod that question. I don't have a point, and I don't have any takeaways. Yes. It's messy. And so obviously, my intent, my fantasy is that you go away thinking about something, actually thinking about something, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, a little squirmy at points. And for me, this is important, and this is how I think about thinking, and what I strive for is a way of thinking about thinking that is nomadic. It doesn't get stuck necessarily in one space, but instead is always changing, and there's a kind of mobility at the center of that thinking. So my talk is actually called On Childhood Towards Nomadic Thinking. So I always like to kind of, after introing something, kind of say, well, but who cares? If I don't have a point, then what's the point? Really, for me, I've worked in a variety of settings. I currently teach at the University of Alberta, and I'm also the president of the board at Latitude 53. I've worked in offices, I've worked in galleries, and one thing that all of those places, those contexts have in common is the idea that our thinking informs our actions. Okay, yeah, that seems, common sense. Of course, it does. But it is for that reason, because it is common sense, that I want to unpack it. I want to actually unfold it. Because if we just assume that everyone knows what that means or what it does, then again, we're less likely to think about it. So the idea that we think and then it produces something, actions in the world, a reality. This is kind of at the center of my research. I won't go into depth, but as a specific example, one thing that I'm looking at is the way that the art encounter has been structured in educational spheres. So not just in art classes, but in social studies, in language arts, in all different areas of the curriculum, how we teach small people and bigger people to interact with art. And in my mind, some of the strategies that we teach in fact limit what can be done in terms of art encounters. So that's kind of a specific example of my work. In this space, I'm hoping to kind of talk more broadly, especially in terms of the idea of the child. So I'm going to start with a story. Do you guys like stories? I don't really need this. I'm going to tell you a story about me as a child. So when I was little, I created in my unfinished basement in the north side, we didn't have a lot of things there. I created an entire world of paper dolls. Some of you may have heard this story before. They had houses, they all had wardrobes, they had cars, there was pets, there was families, different kinds of families. It was very interesting. And I recently was reunited with these paper dolls. They're sitting in my storage closet. I haven't opened them because I'm really embarrassed. I probably should have brought something to show you. And so I often reflect on this because it was really interesting. At the time that I was making this, probably from the time I was about 7 till 13 or 14, I would make this world, and it started with like houses and a Pizza Hut and a swimming pool and a school, because that was my perception of the world. That's what existed in the north side. And there was friendships, and there was complex things happening between characters. But what I found when I reflect on it is that I would play with it for a few minutes, maybe let my sister play, although I would boss her around in terms of what everything did. And then I would realize I needed something. Oh, this person needs a pet. This person, they need a new house, or there needs to be a car, or I need to develop a new character. And so really what I spent most of my time doing was creating the world, fabulating. Of course, it was based on my perceptions of what was happening around me, but ultimately it was kind of a reflection of the world as well as a creation of a world. And so when I think about that, I think about how nomadic I was in my thinking. I said thinking lots of times. I was very flexible. I didn't get stuck to any one idea. In fact, I was always changing and actually navigating kind of an ambiguity, a dissonance between what I perceived as being the world and what the real world was. And in that way, I was always creating new meaning for myself. So I think about this, and I think about the figure of the nomad. Now, this is something that Deleuze talks about, so I'm not coming up with these things necessarily all on my own, but I'm interested in how they work. So we have the nomad, and if we start to think of it as a figure of thought, then we can suggest that maybe what this means is that our thinking is very mobile, characterized by multiplicities. And so that there's this movement always happening at the heart of thinking. It's kind of instilled at the heart of thinking. Now, as I went through school and became educated, I started to think differently because my interests changed, or put differently, what was in my best interest changed. And so I started to think more about this, and I started to develop some different figures of thought. Again, reading and borrowing from Deleuze and a few other people. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to talk about the nomad and also present to you a few other figures of thought. And then from there I want to open it up and see what you think about these ways of thinking. So the worker, I think this is actually what education systems originally strived for. I won't go into the history of education, but ultimately it was to produce, effective workers that can contribute to the workforce in certain ways. But if we think about thought in terms of the worker, then what we're thinking of is the idea that we're able to take instructions, remember things, but not necessarily be able to think on our own. Let me just get my notes, because there's a few other points I wanted there. So within the worker, like I said, education system kind of produces this. There's the idea that we want thought to be something about remembering, but not necessarily understanding. It's about taking instructions, perhaps, and carrying them out, and not necessarily thinking on our own. So thought, when we propose it as kind of this figure of the worker, becomes compliance. What do you expect from me, and how can I do that for you? And I see this often, even at the university level, maybe especially at the university level, because of things like grades and all sorts of other things. We've come to learn to think about thinking in terms of the end, as opposed to the means. What will this thinking kind of produce, or what will it get me, right? And compliance. So the figure of the worker is more about compliance. I also thought a little bit about, and you guys I hope will like this one, the figure of the entrepreneur. Some giggles. Entrepreneur. Okay, so this might be squirmy, hopefully, maybe. For me, this is what's starting to happen in education. In Alberta Education, actually, they introduced with a new project called Inspiring Education, something called the 3 E's, where we now want students to be ethical citizens, have an entrepreneurial spirit, and be engaged thinkers. These are all great things. I'm not suggesting that these are bad things. My question is, what does it do? What does it produce? So when we think about thought in terms of this idea of the entrepreneur, what we're thinking about is that ideas are a form of capital. It is something that I can trade with you for something that I can gain from. So this idea of capital. In terms of the entrepreneur, what it means is that we want to lay claim to concepts. We want to lay claim to thinking so that we can name it and that we can exchange it in some way. And when I first talked to Brandon, he's like, Creative Mornings, and I was really excited because I write a lot about creativity, and one of the things he said is it's not a TED Talk, necessarily. It's more open, and there's nothing wrong with TED Talks, but this is something I'm very interested in, is that once we come to know something, once it becomes kind of common sense, once we lay claim to a concept, what happens to it? What does it do? Right? So it's not necessarily good or bad. My question is, what does it do? So we could think about thought in terms of this idea that thinking is a form of capital. We see this a lot with the knowledge economy. There's a lot of people that write about it. Another way of thinking about thinking. The fourth way of thinking about thinking, we might also have some fans of this, is the hacker. And I kind of borrowed this from Deleuze. Deleuze talks about the smith and their metallurgical kind of processes. And I think of it in our time more of the hacker. And the hacker is someone who looks at systems, in our case maybe thinking, and is able to navigate that through interventions and create holy spaces. Holy as in holes, although you can interpret that as you will. Holy spaces. So they actually intervene. It's a form of thought that's about intervention. So although that certain common sense ways of thinking about the world are out there, certain ways of systems of thought, the hacker looks to kind of create these holes, intervene in some way, and to actually deconstruct what's happening, potentially. What else did I write for hacker? For hacker thought, for the hacker, thought looks to interstices, to the lacuna that exists in any system, right? So although systems might seem very closed and that we can't change things, they're kind of looking for ways to navigate that system. Okay, so we have the nomad, someone who's kind of at the center of thought is mobility, changing, kind of embracing that. The only thing that stays the same is kind of an instability. The worker who looks to think in terms of compliance, what is needed from me at this time and how do I do that? The entrepreneur who looks to thinking as something that we can lay claim to and then exchange for some kind of goods or services. And then the hacker who kind of looks into these holy spaces in order to intervene. When I think of the child and my childhood, I think about how I was able to move between these things more easily. And in that way, I was very nomadic in the very way that I thought. In certain situations, I might have been thinking more like this. You know, my mom wants me to do certain things, and they'll be in my best interest to do that. I actually have a good example of this, where I went door to door selling artwork once when I was 8. Made a few dollars. And so what I'm trying to say is that these are not necessarily static categories. They're not something that you can go online and take a test for. What kind of thinker am I? Because ultimately what that would produce is labels, which would then limit our thinking. And so by putting thought into these figures, what I'm really trying to work out is what might it produce? What might our thinking produce? And how can we start to ask different questions, potentially? So, from there, after our figures of thought, sorry, this is very different than teaching all of these things. The question is, what do we do with this, right? So we could, you know, I know there's a good Reggie Watts talk where he talks about if we thought about thinking all day, then you would just get a headache, which happens to me often. But really, I think it is at the heart of some of the key questions we have in all of our professions. Questions around ethics, questions around subjectivity, which is just a fancy way of saying how we perceive the world. Questions of power and authority come up in terms of these conversations. And ultimately, for me, questions of how to believe in the world. I think it's really easy in our contemporary moment to kind of get stuck in certain places, in certain common sense ways of thinking. And that's really my big kind of, if I do have a soapbox, that's it, is how do we start to question some of the common sense understandings, some of the ways that we've come to label things in order to contain them and ultimately limit thinking. How do we start to question that? So what I'm hoping to do with you today is to keep experimenting with these ideas and create our own fabulations. So similar to my world of paper dolls, what I'm hoping to do is use these figures, create context, create conversations, spaces for dialogue where we can fabulate a world. Instead of just trying to make meaning of our world, we can ask, what does something do? What does our thinking actually do? So hopefully this will urge us to ask new questions instead of what does something mean. I think this happens a lot. What does it mean? What does my thinking mean? And we can blame Freud for that. Instead of asking, what does this mean? And we can kind of spiral down into that. What does it do? So I want to draw you back to the Deleuze quote again. If the protests of children were heard in kindergarten, if their questions were attended to, it would be enough to explode the entire educational system. And so today, and as you go forward, I'm hoping what we can do is start to question our own way of thinking of the world, which is uncomfortable. You might not like the answers you get, in order to explode certain systems that don't work anymore, systems of thinking that don't produce what you want them to produce. So yeah, that's my some initial thoughts, and I have 1 minute left of my 20 minutes. That went by really fast. Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to talking. Hopefully there were some sticky points, some points that you're like, what's happening here? Okay, any questions, thoughts, comments? Let's delve in. Please, yes. Yeah, I think that's a really good question and very complex. So for me, thinking is not necessarily related to intelligence. And if it is, then intelligence needs to be questioned. For me, thinking is about the body and space as well. So we don't just think with our intellect, right? Like this is a product of enlightenment, the enlightenment that all we can figure out the world by thinking about it. And my suggestion is that we actually produce the world through thought. The world doesn't exist, guys. Isn't that crazy? We actually produce it. So in terms of space, I think that this is really applicable because whether you're building spaces or designing spaces or interacting with spaces, I think that how you do that will be informed by your thought processes, probably. I don't know. I don't know if anyone wants to build on that or add or contribute. I always tell my students that if you have a question, I might not answer it, but I will respond. Was there another hand over here? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why the figure of the hacker or the smith is really interesting. I guess I can give you an example maybe. So I teach undergrad students who are training to be teachers. It's a really interesting space because we go through content like how to do this, or I teach specifically second language teachers. So they all have different content. They all have different majors: French, Spanish, German, Mandarin, Japanese. And so we talk about content, but we also talk about pedagogy. So how do we teach? So I teach how do we teach. But it's one thing for me to be like, okay, step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. This is how you teach. That's not going to work. I could spend 5 years telling them how to teach, and they won't know how to teach. So what I try and do is present all of these kind of situations and content and information, and then get them to actually hack it. Look for those holy spaces. Figure out what they're going to do. And prepare them for that, because in the real world, when they get into the classroom, there's a system that exists, and a lot of teachers, I think, get frustrated because there's a lot of policy that comes down. Our education system is provincial, so there's a lot of ideologies that come with that, and maybe we forget about that sometimes. But I always tell them that teachers actually have the most power, because you can close your door. And you can actually have these micro revolutions. We're not going to have a necessarily huge revolution like where we'd, ban all of standardized testing and all these things. But you can actually, this is probably why, this is dangerous thinking in a lot of ways, right? So this idea that you can actually work within the system to find those spaces, and they always exist. To actually produce something that is actually going to be beneficial for the students in that space. So I don't know if that example helps. I don't know if anyone has other examples that they want to add, Brandon, or a question.
Yeah, I was wondering about one of the things that I was thinking about, and maybe wrapping back to childhood, something I've been thinking about since we've talked is how do we think as people if we aren't influenced by an institution like something?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you saying that we are nomadic thinkers when we start off, and then we learn other ways of thinking as we go down the path, or how are we as people? And isn't that part of who we are? And are there ways that we can re-encourage how we originally thought when we were kids?
I love that question, and it has too many ideas right now. My head is going to explode. Again, so in every question that we have, there's certain assumptions. The assumption is that we're born natural, and there's an original self. Yeah. So, and then, but the question is, how do we prove this, right? And this is why, for me, positivism or like being able to know the world through just observations is really difficult because we can't. So, so I don't know how we start off because I've never, we can't talk to we can't get in babies' minds. This is your new task as you move forward.
In your paper doll world, right?
Yeah.
Like, you weren't as influenced then as you are now.
Yeah.
There's a mode of thinking that you were creating, right?
Yeah.
You compared it to, I was thinking more nomadic.
Mm-hmm. So my I guess overall response is that, and this is drawing on Deleuze, what actually is at the heart of everything is desire. So when I'm a child, I have different desires. And that's what I was trying to, in terms of these, there's a reason why we think in this way. It's not that it's bad, you know, in all these different ways. It's because it serves an interest. Not my interests, necessarily, but it serves an interest. And so the question for me is that how does desire become manipulated, right? To be more about interest. Capitalism this is how capitalism works. My work focuses on capitalism, but I didn't want to go too deep there. So when I was younger, my desire was, I mean, I can only speculate because I don't remember thinking about it. But I assume that I just really wanted to spend my time doing something. I was bored. I wanted to create, and we didn't have a lot of like resources to have all the fancy Barbie dolls and stuff, so I was just like, I'm gonna make them myself. So I still wanted these things, but because I wasn't able to have them in those ways, I was able to create them. And it might have been, of course, I had an environment around me. My dad was really influential in helping me. It was really instrumental in why I chose to start drawing as opposed to maybe making music or these other things. So I definitely think the environment highly influences us. And so the question is, and that's not a problem. I think we need to, if we didn't operate within a society or an institution, then we would be mentally ill. That's how we often define people that are mentally ill, is that they're unable to function in a certain space, right? With the norms at play there. So my question is, these are not necessarily bad things, or when our thinking changes, or when we get when we become educated, it's not necessarily bad, but my question is, what does it do? What does it produce? And if we start questioning that, maybe we'll come up with new solutions to, you know, everything from little problems like staff or management issues, or to maybe bigger, my idealist kind of thinking about, you know, some of the bigger problems we have in the world around class or race or subjectivities. I don't know if that answered. I know someone had a hand, maybe was going to help me out or add. Mm-hmm.
You created a Pizza Hut, your house, and school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, like, I don't know if there's ever a time when we are not influenced by some systems. It may be a basic system, like our homes.
Yeah.
But that's part of childhood development, is that we learn to operate in systems, like you said. But I was wondering about kind of nomadic thinking. As children, we're limited in what we see and what we experience. So then as we get older, we have all these opportunities. So it's almost like the original system teaches us how to decide which ones are important to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, where do we go? And maybe part of that goes from our desires. So, like, our desires lead to the places that we pay attention more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because, like, I know I don't do math. Like, I mean, I can, and it's okay. But in school, I was never like, awesome, I get to go to algebra. But I loved reading, and I loved talking, and the books and everything. So I think that there's some, how do you talk about thinking whenever it comes to those desires? Like, and maybe this question is, how do we encourage children to go towards those desires young?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think goes with some Montessori kind of educational stuff, that children should be able to explore what they love.
Yeah.
And then they will keep learning.
I agree with those things, and a lot of other things come to mind. So I agree that, and Deleuze, drawing on Deleuze, he says that we can only know a thing based on the relationships it enters into. So I am not an I. I'm a complex thing that also has all these connections. I'm connected to my family. I'm connected to my upbringing, to my schooling, to all of these things. I don't exist on my own in some ways. And so I think that in that way, kind of our thinking acts like a machine. There's all sorts of connections happening at any given time, and certain connections will produce this, and certain connections will produce this, and certain connections will produce this. But when we enter into school, and we know, and for some reason, and this is why I'm not interested in what does our thinking mean, because it could be like, I love reading. That must mean I had books in my house when I was little, or my parents were into reading. And of course, those are interesting things to explore, but I'm more interested in what does it do? I think that's more productive. So I really like reading. So what I'm going to do, and I do well in reading, so I'm always curious too, and I talk about this with my students because they're like, I'm a visual learner. I'm like, that's great. What happens when information isn't visual? What are you going to do? Because for me, learning, and this is something that I think children are able to navigate better and due to this kind of nomadic thinking. Learning is really hard. It's uncomfortable. When you learn, I can't even spell, uncomfortable. When you're actually learning something new, when you're actually thinking about something, engaged in thought processes, you're often in a space that's vulnerable because you don't know it yet. And we get taught really early that you need to know the answer. You need to know it because you need to reproduce it, whether it's on a test or a task or whatever. Be creative, but know the answer. Like I'm finding more and more in education because creativity is huge right now in educational discourses. But my question again is, what does that form of creativity teach? It teaches students that, I think it teaches students a certain kind of taste and aesthetic. Because often students that are creative are producing something beautiful or it fits into a certain system, as opposed to a student that dissents. That student is a bad student. They're a behavior issue. They get coded. They get a label, because then we don't have to think about them. I'm being extreme now. But this, so I love this idea, it builds it out more, is that thinking, and for me, relates to learning. And this is not a question of education or schooling. We're all learning all the time. And I think that this group, even by being here this early, is interested in learning. But I think we've also been taught that learning should be fun. It's sideways. Learning should be fun, right? Edutainment. That's a big buzzword right now. And of course, we want to support our students. And I always talk about this balance we need between challenge and support. But also we have to prepare students to understand that learning is really, really hard. Like if you've had to learn a second language, or if you're working through math problems or music, drawing, people always say, I suck at drawing, I have no talent. And I'm like, you just have to spend 20 years drawing. It's hard. And then you'll be better at drawing, but it's really hard. It takes a long time. With languages too, these things are hard, and I think we do children a disservice by saying, "Don't worry, you're special. You can do it, and it will be, it'll be fun," because that's not true. So when I think of what's really important for me in terms of my work in the Nomad, is that it's about how do we navigate ambiguity or the spaces that are really, really messy, right? Instead of just labeling something so that we know it, how do we actually start practicing thinking, which means it doesn't feel good all the time. We get maybe a bit of a tummy ache, maybe you're squirming, or you're like, what's happening? I think this is where thinking actually happens, but it can be difficult. So it's something that we have to almost work towards in education itself. So this is the way that I'm kind of thinking about it more specifically. Yes, Vicky? Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and so this is the balance, and this is why pedagogy is a science and an art. So, I mean, a quick answer, this is why I hope people would go into education, and what I hope to provide students when I work with them is to start thinking about it. My first response is that we have to actually open up our thinking, because it's really easy to get stuck in the yeah buts. Yeah, but. And so what I'm really interested in is something more along the lines of micropolitics. So your question is that if we think nomadic thinking is more beneficial in terms of learning, but then the system sets us up for these things, my question is, how do we start teaching? Because schooling is a microcosm in many ways of other systems that exist in society. So how do we start working with students to navigate that ambiguity while still recognizing that there's systems in place? And they're not bad. The education system we have is very, very good, especially internationally. And so this is what I get into, I think, a lot in conferences, is people always are like, well, if it's not this, then it has to be this. And my thinking is always, it's never either or, but always and. So and that's why the categories are not meant to be pejorative or like hierarchy. There's no hierarchy. I think that we have to learn to be workers in certain situations, but we also have to understand what that produces. So I guess my summary answer is that getting students to think about their thinking. What is this thinking doing, right? and then hopefully taking ownership of that thinking and being able to question their thinking, especially when it becomes really common sense. I always think of the idea of freedom in our contemporary moment, and in Canada we're free, right? We're free. This is a common sense thing that everybody knows. We're free. So, but when we actually start thinking about that, what does it mean? What does that thinking do? What happens when we start to unpack it? So if students were able to do that, I think that we would get very different results, but it could be potentially dangerous. Maybe this is why I don't teach in the school system. Yeah. Awesome! I was hoping that there would be teachers. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that's perfect. And this is the 21st century learning model is something that actually provoked my research because there's a lot of focus on visual literacy in the arts. And again, I think that that's really good, but my question is, what does it produce? And I guess my one fear of the 21st century model is that it really does focus on how do we create not workers, but maybe entrepreneurs that can compete in the globalizing marketplace, right? Especially when we're competing with Daniel Pink's called, the 3 A's, Asia, automatism, and what's the other one? No? Daniel Pink? Okay, good. I'm glad you don't know Daniel.
It's actually used 2 A's.
Oh, yes, exactly. Someone can Google it. Sarah. Yeah. And that's a great example of it. It's not, entrepreneurism is not bad, and it's not about what it means or defining it. It's like, what does it do? And it's not inherently bad, but what happens is that it enters into certain discourses or the machine of capitalism, for instance, and this idea of laying claim. There's all sorts of new intellectual property laws that are being explored and created, and which actually limits creativity, right? So although entrepreneurial, when you first hear it, common sense, or everybody knows, it's about creation and getting out there and spreading ideas and all these great things, I'm always concerned about, like, what does it actually produce? Because we're always in a system. We're always affected by all of these things that are going around us. But it's really easy to just be like, well, what's the point of anything? And so what I'm trying to get at in this, why don't we just all go to sleep and take a long nap? And hopefully when we wake up, things are better. But by thinking about these things, what I'm ultimately trying to do is show that there's always potential. There's always holes. There's always space for dissent, for resistance. to re-machine things. That's my big project, is that not that the machine needs to disappear or that it's bad and we should all just be free, because I don't even know, like, what does it mean to be natural or original or free? I'm more interested in how can we re-machine the parts so that it produces something that is beneficial and that we can actually have belief in the world. Because I know teachers, I hear this all the time too, it's really hard. Teaching, I think, is the hardest job. I don't care what anyone else says. Teaching is the hardest job. It's really easy to become really despondent and just be like, well, I'll just do the same thing I've always done because there's no point in trying something new. It's very easy to get there, and it's not that that person is a bad person or not smart. That's not the issue. It's the issue is, how do we create belief in the world again with all of these really, really limiting structures in place? And my thinking is that by changing our thought process, by learning to navigate the system, but potentially in a more nomadic way, I think that we can create new belief in the world, new space for resistance, even at that micro-political level. So not about big protests, but in the conversations you have with people, in the connections that you form, in the eye contact that you make, in the way that you feel in those spaces, right, in conversations. I think that that's where the real kind of power lies in terms of change and these kinds of things, if we're looking at the bigger picture. Was there another hand over here? Sorry. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm-hmm.
All the while, worker at No Matter still existing, it's just compiling. And now we have this hacker slash sort of thinking. And my question is, do those all continue to move on into the next level of thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Level of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
going back to nomadic thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and see what happens again. Because from the hacker people are now to the entrepreneurs of that, and say, where can I make more out of this that already exists and make it more? So,
Mm-hmm.
is there a next level of thinking, or are we just trying to combine all of these somehow and make one great big sort of cosmic thing?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and it's something I thought a lot about when preparing this talk. I find it hard to give short talks, so I'm glad we had a discussion because I feel like it's more productive. Because my answer is, this was my thinking this week. And tomorrow I might have 4 new things. And that's the point. And so I know that it might seem abstract or kind of esoteric. I hope it doesn't sound, I hope that you're not just me to, like our coffee meeting. I know. But ultimately is that I'm presenting this today because this is the way I'm thinking about my world. This is how I'm actually worlding myself. This is my world, right? It's not exhaustive, of course, because we can never actually put all this stuff that's in our head, on paper or in a conversation. So this is how I'm worlding today, much like when I made my paper dolls. But the idea is, and this is a big thing in academia, is that for me, it's not, I don't want to hinge everything on those ideas, because that'll limit me, right? Because what if tomorrow I have this new thing, but I'm like, but that doesn't fit into my model. I'll just get rid of it. I'm known at the university for this. And if I add that, then I won't have this thing anymore, right? And so that's why I think it's important that we're constantly, and this is hard, right? Because we're busy. Everyone's busy, right? There's been the new thing in 2014 is, last year it was like, everyone's busy, the busy complex, and now this year it's like, get rid of the busy complex, right? We're all supposed to, have you guys been reading these articles in the New York Times, all of these things? Yeah, exactly. Well, but everyone's New Year's resolution is to start saying no to things, right? And to be less busy. Yeah, exactly. That's my that's actually, so it's that we're all busy, and thinking, I think, takes not just time, but a certain energy and a certain discomfort, right? You've probably asked yourself tough questions before, everything from like, should I live here? Should I go to school? Should I have a family? These things, when you start thinking about them, potentially can problematize things in your life. And if you're busy, I told some friends this week, I'm like, I have no time for feelings this week, because it was a new moon, and apparently it was under Cancer, and it was going to mean lots of feelings. And I was like, I know, I'm ignoring the moon, even though I love it, because I don't have time for feelings this week. It's really busy. I have to do this Creative Mornings talk. Full moon. What did I say? New moon. Sorry, full moon. So this idea of how do we make space to actually question our own thinking. I think it's one of the things that we talk about in meetings or in spaces, where we talk as creatives. When we have these conversations, is how do we engage people, or how do we create dialogue, or blah blah blah. I'm more interested in how do you start doing that within your own thought system, creating dialogue and dissent within our own thinking. That's really hard, right? Because when we know something, we feel comfortable there. It becomes habit. It becomes our home. And this is one thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but Brandon and I talked a lot. One of his questions was, okay, but if we're nomadic all the time, that would be really hard. You can't just be a nomad all the time. And I completely agree. Because if you were nomadic in your thinking all the time, again, I think you would be probably labeled schizophrenic. You wouldn't be able to function necessarily. And Deleuze, this is what he talks about. However, so we need this sense of home, even if it's in terms of how we think about ourselves. Identity is a good example of home. I need to know that I am me, I am Jessie. But that's not necessarily true. It changes all the time who Jessie is, and it's hard to measure. So I do need these kind of, this sense of home, this sense of habit, some common sense understanding of the world. But my suggestion is that we also have to be open to questioning it, especially if it doesn't work anymore. If you're swimming and you reproduce the same stroke over and over and it doesn't work, what happens? You drown. Yeah, you die. So I hope that's not my quote. You die. You have to experiment. You have to try new things. If you don't know how to swim, you might do this, or you might do. I won't do more actions, but I don't know how to swim. I'm sorry. You try new things, right? So if that stroke does work, maybe it's not effective, but it's still working. Maybe you can hold out on that stroke for a while. But after time, your arms are going to get tired, and you're going to need to try something new. Yeah, or you'll die. I think I will, because I think we're at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me tell you, I took swimming, and there are some dumb strokes out there. That kid that didn't say anything ever, that quoted by that kid, he's going to compete for, I hope somebody wrote that down, and that could be illustrated. No offense to you. You had some wonderful lines, but that kid that doesn't exist, that's a horrible, yeah, it's a wonderful quote. So I think we're all like, oh man, I think, I had bubbles all over the place. My stomach is saying, I'm ready for Duchess. And then, but I did want a couple thoughts, yeah. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is that this is, the idea of home, but I think we also now, because I'm the organizer of Creative Mornings, but I also do consulting work, and I also do other things that I hope to be doing and hope to make public at some point in my future, right? It's this idea that we all have hats now, but our identities are also fragmented, and that's becoming more and more a case for everybody. Not here's my home, here's my job, here's my kids. It's a lot different now, and I think that's something we're all looking at navigating, but that also is how, what role am I in? What role does this person see me in? And how am I thinking in this moment, too, is something that's very interesting. So, but I'm thinking that, that this talk is helping me think about how do I see myself? Maybe my world is still just paper dolls,
None of this actually exists.
I've created paper dolls, and you guys are all paper dolls. But then how I see everybody else, right? My relation, I am a product of relationships, really, and people understand me through those relationships. But now if I'm fragmented and I have relationships in different ways, and then somebody sees my Twitter feed and is like, that is not with who I see that person, that's kind of really weird and trippy. So that's something to think about. Anyway, Friday the 14th, 2014, we have our next talk And TBA is it really stands for to be excited. So like instead of like the E, I replaced that with an A. The theme is rebel, and we have some things that I can't tell you about really quite yet, but we have them cooking. I was even talking about it last night, and I am very stoked. And so you should all pay attention. And I'm gonna leave it there, and go out, enjoy each other's company, and have some food, and finish the coffee off. Thank you very much.